What we are going to do today is a simple example of a macro with containing no parameters at all. So we are trying to expand, or we are trying to do macro expansion of a macro that does not contain any parameters. Just to go through a few basic concepts, okay? The macro can be written with the header called as macro, and the end of the macro can be indicated by the name mend. So the lines that are between this keyword macro and mend is the body of the macro. Now the body of the macro contains a statement called as prototype statement. The prototype statement contains the name of the macro followed by a list of parameters. Since this is a simple program that does not contain any parameters, it contains only the name of the macro. After the prototype statement, we are having two lines. Okay, these are called as ordinary strings, that is, they represent themselves in the expanded code. Okay, so they do not contain any parameters, so there is no substitution to be done. When we expand the code, they are written as it is in the expanded code itself. Okay, they are known as model statements. That means in the expanded code, they are actually assembly language statements. Then after this after these two lines, we have this keyword mend, which indicates end of the macro, followed by we have we are saying that the assembly language program begins from here. The keyword start represents it. Then we have a declarative statement in the form of ads1, and then we have this macro call. So to call a macro with no parameters, we simply call it by the name of the macro itself, and then we have end. Okay, so when the macro processor sees this piece of code, so it will see that there's a first line called as macro. So it knows that a macro has been written here. So certain entries have to be made in data structures. Okay, so the first data structure that we would require would be the macro name table, which would contain what is the name of the macro, how many positional parameters it has, how many keyword parameters it has, how many expansion time variables it has, a pointer to your macro definition table, a pointer to your keyword parameter table, and a pointer to your sequencing symbol table. Now, since this is a very simple macro that does not contain any parameters, most of the fields would be blank over here. Since we have only one macro definition table which would list out the body of the macro, there would be a single keyword parameters table containing default values, if any. That is why we have a pointer to the table, keyword parameter default table pointer. And since there is a single sequencing symbol table, that's why we have a pointer to the sequencing table itself. Okay, but most of the fields here would be blank. Okay, because this is a simple macro that does not contain any parameters, and the name of the macro happens to be simple. Okay, so when the macro processor sees this keyword macro, it sees that it will know that the first word following this keyword macro happens to be known as the name of the macro. So what it does is it goes to this macro name table and enters the name of the macro, which is simple. Since this is a macro that does not contain any positional parameters, the count will be 0. There are no keyword parameters. There are no expansion term variables. For this, it will look at the macro definition table. So if you look below here, there's a macro definition table, and we see that there is number 1 present here. So in the MDTP, it will point 1. That means the body of this macro called as simple will be stored at location 1 in the macro definition table. So initially, KPDPT will be made 1 and SSTP will be made 1. This is according to the algorithm that is given by author Dhamdhere in his book System Programming and Operating Systems. Okay, since the tables are empty, I have not shown the tables. When we have keyword parameters, we will show those tables, but later on, when we realize at the end that there are no keyword parameters, they will be turned to 0. But right now, initially, they are all set to 1. So once we have done the processing of this macro name called as simple, then we take the next line, which is a model statement, and we put them into the macro definition table, because these are lines that belong to the body of the macro. So we take the first line and we place it into this MDT, and we write add a register comma a, and then we increment the pointer by 1. Okay, And we go to the next line. The next line itself also is a model statement, basically containing no parameters, so we write them as it is in the next line. Okay, so of the MDT, so we write move R a register, comma, um, comma a, and then we increment the pointer by 1, and then we see mend. Okay, mend also is included in this MDT because it needs to indicate if there are more than one macro, then I need to know that these two lines belong to the first macro, and then the lines following the mend would be lines that belong to a second or a third macro if it exists in your code. Okay, and we increment this MDT by 1. Okay, so once we finish mend, so macro processor knows that there are no more lines, no more macros in this particular program. So all it does is it goes for the expansion part. So if after following this keyword mend, okay, it looks at start. Okay, and since start is an assembly code, so what it does is it will write the statement as it is. Okay, and then it'll go to the next line. The next line, it look at the opcode. The opcode is DS, so there is no expansion involved. It's not a macro call, so there's no expansion involved. It'll write the line like as it is. But next time it will see this keyword simple. Okay, now this, it knows it is a macro call. How does it know it's a macro call? See, when I see the keyword start, when I see the word start, okay, then it will compare it with this macro names in the MT. So it compares it with simple, and it sees that start and simple are not matching, and therefore it's not a macro call, and that's why it is written as it is. Similarly, DS, okay, it will match DS with simple, so no match occurs, so it copies that line as it is. Now when it comes to simple, when it tries to match with the MNT, a match occurs, so it says that this is a macro call. So the first thing it will do is it will set up this macro expansion counter. It's a counter that keeps track of the next line that has to be expanded. Okay, and it is set to the MDTP value of simple. The MDTP value of simple is 1, so it is set to 1. So this is how MEC is set to 1. So now what will happen is, now your macro processor will go to the first line of your MDT, and it will see that this line, okay, is add a register a. So there are no parameters. It's simply an ordinary statement, ordinary string that does not contain any parameters. So all it does is it takes it and it writes it in this expanded code. So it will say add a register, comma a, and after that the MEC value is incremented by 1, so it becomes 2. So it go to the next line. The next line also is simply an ordinary string that represents itself, and there is no parameter substitution to be done, so it copies that line as it is in the expanded code. So it writes move R a register, comma a. Okay, next MEC becomes 3, and when it sees 3, it says mend, so it says that all the lines that are belonging to this macro called as simple is expanded. Okay, so after this macro expansion, it will see that there is this line called as n. Compared to the macro name, there's only one macro name that is simple and does not match, so it's not a macro call and need not be expanded. Okay, so we have here this is the expanded code for this simple code that does not contain a macro that does not contain any parameters. So this is very simple example. Okay, but after this, please remember that the KPDP value is set to 0 and SSTP value also is set to 0, but this happens before the expansion. After we fill this MDT, okay, because there were no keyword parameters, the value is turned to 0 and SSTP value is also turned to 0, and once we do that, then the expansion part goes. Okay, I did that. I directly went to the expanded code, but that is not how it happens. Once the MDT is completed, it will check that there are no keyword parameters, so the value is turned to 0. There are no sequencing symbols, so the value is turned to 0, and then the expansion takes place. Okay, by comparing this keyword by this word start with the macro name, and if it's a match, if it's a match, then it's a macro call, that means macro expansion has to take place. If it is not, it will copy the line as it is. Okay, and when it's a call, it will set the MEC value based on the MDTP value, and it will copy one line after the other into the expanded code. So this is a simple example for a macro without any parameters.